Your fastmcp tool runs perfectly in development, but how do you package it for others to install with zero manual setup? You'll see how a minimal, fastmcp.json configuration defines just the essentials, the server's entry point, optional dependencies like pandas and requests, and schema validation, while leaving runtime behavior like transport and logging to the optional deployment section. This declarative approach replaces CLI flags like with for dependencies, and the schema reference even enables IDE features like autocomplete.
Schema https://gofastung.com/public/schemas/fastmcp json/v1 json. Source path server pi entry-point MCP environment dependencies pandas requests.
This demonstrates fastmcp's modular configuration pattern, where JSON manifests declare tool integration requirements without embedding runtime logic. The schema follows a where what-how structure, source location, environment dependencies, and optional deployment settings, with each section being independently optional. Unlike monolithic setup scripts, this approach uses declarative metadata that validates against fastmcp's v1 specification while maintaining compatibility with IDE tooling. The pattern works by separating concerns into orthogonal configuration blocks with sensible defaults. The source section defines execution entry points, defaulting to file system access. Environment lists dependencies, defaulting to UV-based resolution, and deployment, when present, handles transport and logging. This modularity lets you override individual aspects, like swapping stdio for HTTP transport, without rewriting the entire configuration, while the schema reference enables editor features like autocomplete and validation. This approach replaces CLI complexity with version-controlled, environment-specific files, dev, fastmcp, JSON, prod, fastmcp, JSON, while acknowledging that production typically requires additional deployment settings. It solves the problem of implicit environment assumptions by making dependencies and entry points explicit, though runtime behavior still depends on the deployment section for transport and logging configuration. The trade-off is initial verbosity for long-term maintainability, particularly in team environments where consistent tool integration matters more than quick iteration. Let's break it down line by line. This defines a fastmcp tool configuration using JSON schema validation. The mandatory structure follows fastmcp's where what-how pattern. Source locates the implementation, optional environment declares dependencies with default UV resolver, and production would add a deployment section for runtime settings. The schema reference enables IDE validation and autocomplete while allowing environment-specific files like dev, fastmcp, JSON. This replaces CLI arguments like with for dependencies while maintaining optional fields with sensible defaults.
Schema https://gofastung.com/public/schemas/fastmcp json/v1 json.
This JSON schema reference enables IDE validation against fastmcp's v1 specification, provides autocomplete and error checking while keeping the configuration optional for basic use cases. The schema reference follows fastmcp's where what-how pattern, where source defines location, environment handles dependencies, and deployment, not shown, configures runtime behavior.
Source.
The source key specifies your tool's implementation location and entry point. It tells fastmcp where to find the Python file and which function handles MCP requests, following the standard configuration pattern. This is the first part of fastmcp's optional 3-section config, source environment deployment. where source type defaults to file system if unspecified.
Path server pi.
Specifies the server module containing your MCP tools. This path points to the Python file where fastmcp will discover and load all at MCP tool decorated functions, establishing the execution context. The field uses a default file system type if unspecified, with the actual runtime behavior controlled by the optional deployment section.
Entry point MCP.
Specifies the fastmcp execution entry point as the MCP symbol in server pi. This follows fastmcp's configuration as code pattern, where the entry point field explicitly declares the root handler, while the optional environment section manages dependencies like pandas and requests. The JSON schema reference enables IDE validation and autocomplete, replacing CLI arguments like with for cleaner environment-specific setups. This closing brace completes the optional environment configuration block, which specifies Python dependencies for this fastmcp tool. The schema reference enables IDE validation and autocomplete, while the structure follows fastmcp's where what-how pattern. Source defines location, environment handles dependencies, and deployment, not shown here, would configure runtime behavior. Production setups typically split this into environment-specific files and include deployment settings for complete CLI replacement.
Environment.
The optional environment section declares runtime dependencies for the fastmcp tool, like Python packages. It follows fastmcp's where what-how configuration pattern, where this handles the what dependencies, while source defines where code location and deployment, omitted here, would specify HOW, runtime behavior. This configuration replaces CLI arguments like with for dependencies, enabling environment-specific setups through JSON files, e.g., dev fastmcp.json. The schema reference provides IDE validation and autocomplete, while optional type fields default. File system for source, UV for environment, allow customization.
Dependencies, pandas, requests.
Declares Python package dependencies required by the tool. fastmcp installs these automatically via pip before execution, ensuring pandas is available for data operations and requests for HTTP calls. This optional environment section follows fastmcp's configuration as code pattern, replacing CLI arguments like with while maintaining portability across environments. This closing brace completes the minimal fastmcp configuration object, which follows the where what-how pattern through its optional sections. The schema reference enables IDE validation and autocomplete, while source path and source. Entry point define the tool's location and execution target with file system as the default type. Environment dependencies lists Python packages, but remains optional, with UV as the default manager when specified. This closing brace completes the fastmcp JSON configuration object, ensuring valid JSON syntax. The configuration follows fastmcp's where what-how pattern through optional sections. Source defines the tool location and entry point. Environment declares Python dependencies, defaulting to UV package manager if omitted, while production setups typically add a deployment section for runtime behavior. The schema reference enables IDE validation and autocomplete, replacing CLI arguments like with for dependencies while allowing environment-specific files like dev fastmcp.json. Fastmcp configuration pattern. The optional fastmcp.json manifest adopts a where what-how structure through its source environment deployment sections, with only the source section being required. Type fields default to file system, for source and UV for environment, while the deployment section handles runtime behavior like transport and logging when present. A minimal configuration handles dependencies and source location, while production setups typically split into environment-specific files like dev, fastmcp, JSON, and prod, fastmcp, JSON.
The optional field that goes unused still shapes what must be declared.